Today we are reading from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, entitled Jnana Yoga, and we're reading text number 4. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So text number 6.4. Yadā hi nendriyārtheṣu na karmasv anuṣajjate sarva-saṅkalpa-sannyāsī yogārūḍhas tadocyate. Yadā hi nendriyārtheṣu na karmasv anuṣajjate sarva-saṅkalpa-sannyāsī yogārūḍhas tadocyate. Yadā hi nendriyārtheṣu na karmasv anuṣajjate sarva-saṅkalpa-sannyāsī yogārūḍhas tadocyate. Word for word. Yada, when. He, certainly. Na, not. Nendriyārtheṣu, in sense gratification. Na, never. Karmasv, in fruitive activity. Anuṣajjate, one necessarily engages. Sarva-saṅkalpa, of all material desires. Sannyāsī, renouncer. Yogārūḍhas, elevated in yoga. Yadā, at that time. Uchyate, is said to be. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. A person is said to be elevated in yoga when, having renounced all material desires, he neither acts for sense gratification nor engages in fruitive activity. Purport. When a person is fully engaged in the transcendental loving service of the Lord, and he is pleased in himself, and he thus is no longer engaged in sense gratification or fruitive activity. Otherwise, one must be engaged in sense gratification, since one cannot live without engagement. Without Krishna consciousness, one must always be seeking self-centered or extended selfish activity. But a Krishna-conscious person can do everything for the satisfaction of Krishna, and thereby be perfectly detached from sense gratification. One who has no such realization must mechanically try to escape material desires before being elevated to the top rung of yoga ladder. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kajamayam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandayaham Sri Guruho Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Sri Rupam Sagrijatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Advaitam Savadutam Paritana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Divisakam. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Deenabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavane Sri Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patikanam Papanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Dikshadharane. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Rama. So Hare Krishna everybody, and welcome to today's class. Today we're speaking on 6.4. Yadā hi nendriyārtheṣu na karmasv anuṣajjate sarva-saṅkalpa-sannyāsī yogārūḍhas tadocyate. A person is said to be elevated in yoga when, having renounced all material desires, he neither acts for sense gratification nor engages in fruitive activity. So in order to properly introduce this verse, I'm going to go back a little bit and look how Krishna has presented yoga so far. He started in the 5th chapter, 27 and 28. He started to introduce yoga. He was explaining how one keeps the external sense objects away, keeps the vision concentrated between the eyebrows, the breath suspended, and controlling the mind, senses, and intelligence. The transcendentalist aiming at liberation becomes free from desire, fear, and anger. One who is always in this state is certainly liberated. So some important principles of yoga Krishna is introducing. The object of yoga as Ashtanga yoga, as is introduced from about text 11 onwards in this chapter. Before that, Krishna is introducing some important principles, which we're going through now and through the next 2 or 3 verses. So the purpose of yoga is shutting out the external sense object and thus controlling the mind, senses, and intelligence. And in the verse, Krishna also says that thus the transcendentalist aiming at liberation becomes free from desire, fear, and anger. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada has said right at the end of the purport, this yoga process helps one become free from all kinds of fear and anger, and thus feel the presence of the super soul in the transcendental situation. So this is the yogi. Once he reaches what we're talking about today, the yogārūḍhas state, he becomes, he feels the presence of the super soul. So that's his goal. The Prabhupada continues, in other words, Krishna consciousness is the easiest process of executing yoga principles. This will be thoroughly explained in the next chapter. A Krishna conscious person, however, being always engaged in devotional service, does not risk losing his senses to some other engagement. This is a better way of controlling the senses than by Ashtanga yoga. So in the notes by the VTE, there's a nice quote from Bhaktivinoda Thakur about this dangers of engaging in yoga, being sidetracked along the way. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that the path of yoga is full of obstacles. He explains the pitfalls at each level. So we have the yama, niyama, asana, pranayam, pratyahar, dhyan, dharana, and samadhi. So at the time of practicing yama and niyama, which is the prescriptions and prohibitions, the things we do and the things we don't do. So for us in Krishna consciousness, that's easy. Always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. And in other words, the positive injunction is to chant 16 rounds, and the negative injunction is to follow the 4 prohibitions, regulative principles of freedom. So by practicing yama and niyama, the fruit of religiosity is awakened. And so once someone attains this fruit of religiosity, he may become proud that he is a religious-minded person and forget his aim to approach Prem. So similarly, asana and pranayam, which Bhaktivinoda Thakur explained, is a long process. One's longevity increases and he becomes free from disease. Thus, at this stage of asana and pranayam, this is where the modern yogis get trapped. They can be enamored by the side effect of a long life and free from disease and forget the goal of life. The process of pratyahara awards one's sense control. But if we just perform pratyahara and withdraw from the sense object without achieving Krishna Prem, the result is a dry renunciation, which makes the hard heart as stone, which Prabhupada, which Krishna will talk about in the later in the 11th and 12th chapter. During Dhyan, Dharana, and Samadhi, material thoughts are removed, but if Prema is not reached, then there is a danger that the living entity will lose its identity. Thus, the ultimate goal of yoga is excellent, but the path is full of difficulty. So, and then the last verse of the 5th chapter. Bhaktaram yagyatapasam sarva-loka maheshwaram sufridam sarva-bhutana yatvamam shantim rityate. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerity, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material misery. So this Krishna is giving as the antidote for this yoga. He's explained in 27 and 28 this yoga process. But then he comes back and says that if you know Krishna is the enjoyer, the proprietor, and he's the well-wisher of everybody, then you don't need yoga. And towards the end of the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, everything depends on one's practical performance of duties in Krishna consciousness, which in every respect helps one to control the senses and conquer the influence of desire and anger. And one who stands fast in Krishna consciousness, controlling the above-mentioned passions, remains factually in the transcendental state, or Brahma Nirvana. The eightfold yoga mysticism is automatically practiced in Krishna consciousness because the ultimate purpose is served. There is a gradual process of elevation in the practice of yama, niyama, asana, pranayam, pratyahara, dharana, dhyan, and samadhi. But these only preface perfection by devotional service, which alone can award peace to the human being. This is the perfection of life. So I've got some examples of that also, how one can seemingly become perfect in the practice of yoga, but not having achieved this stage of devotional service, one actually doesn't achieve perfection. So in yesterday's verse, these two terms were introduced. Arurukshoho, which means beginning in yoga, and the term that comes back again in today's verse, arudasya, which means one who has attained yoga. So the process is explained that in verse 3. For one who is a neophyte in the eightfold yoga system, work is said to be the means. And for one who is already elevated in yoga, cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. So what this means is that in the earlier stages, with this yama, niyama, asana, and pratyahara, one is engaged in all sorts of activities. This yama and niyama is prescribed duties and prohibitions. So Prabhupada goes on to say, concerning the Eightfold Yoga system, attempts in the beginning to enter into meditation through regulative principles of life and practice of different sitting postures. These are more or less bodily exercise, are considered fruitive material activity. All such activities lead to mental equilibrium to control the senses. So when one is accomplished in the practice of meditation, then the disturbing mental activities are ceased. Now, there's one last sentence in this paragraph, in the last paragraph for yesterday's verse, that I want to look at, because here Krishna is describing, especially Srila Prabhupada is describing how Krishna conscious person is perfectly situated above the yogis. But there's an interesting verse that I want us, interesting sentence here from Prabhupada that I want us to meditate on. He says, a Krishna conscious person, however, is situated from the beginning on the platform of meditation because he always thinks of Krishna. And being constantly engaged in the service of Krishna, he is considered to have ceased all material activity. So this struck me because we are engaged in the process of Krishna consciousness. But I can tell you that for myself, that I do not always think of Krishna. Prabhupada says that this Krishna conscious person can be seen to be situated on the beginning on the platform of meditation because he always thinks of Krishna. So in order to come to this position, we have to actually control some of these senses and control the mind in order to come to the state of always thinking of Krishna. So when Vaishnav Maharaj gave class a couple of days ago, I asked him, why is Krishna explaining this Ashtanga Yoga so thoroughly when actually he's trying to get us to be engaged in Bhakti Yoga? So Maharaj explained that that Krishna was providing the full explanation in order that Arjuna can properly know how it is. So I've been meditating on that, and I've been thinking that if we go back into the first and the beginning of the second chapter, I think in verse 2.6, Arjuna says that it would be better to live by begging than to engage in fighting and killing all his family members. So Arjuna had this doubt that actually this life of doing nothing and renunciation would be better than engaging in his fighting. So here, Krishna, by thoroughly explaining this yoga system, then Arjuna will come to realize how difficult it is. In the coming verses, verse 5 and 6, Krishna talks about control of the mind. And then after Krishna has explained the whole system, then Arjuna comes back and says, oh, controlling the mind is impossible. It's more difficult than controlling the wind. So by giving a full explanation of yoga here, Krishna is fully explaining to Arjuna the dangers of imagining that we can live by begging, imagining that we can just renounce, go to the forest, and we can become advanced yogis. Like it said in that last verse, imagining that we can come. Imagine that we can come to the process of meditation simply by thinking that we're devotees. We have to first come to that stage of always thinking of Krishna. Okay, so now. So in this verse, okay, let's verse again. there were two things that were described in the verse. A person is said to be elevated in yoga. So this is this yogārūḍhas stage. When having renounced all material desires, he never acts for sense gratification, nor engages in fruitive activity. So Srila Prabhupada explains very thoroughly what this all means. He gave a class on these verses in Los Angeles in 1968. So there are two things here. Acting for sense gratification means trying to do things that will make us happy, or engaging in fruitive activities. So Srila Prabhupada explains engaging in fruitive activities as in doing things to accumulate the facilities for sense gratification. In other words, it's like earning lots of money because we want sense gratification. So we have to go and earn some money so that we can have it. In the material world, Prabhupada also describes that as bhoga-tyāg. A person engages in work 5 days a week in order to have 2 days of holiday, and then he thinks he's got sense gratification. But actually, he's worked hard for 5 days to get to that state. So these two things, the yogi does not do when he's advanced. He renounced, and in addition to that, he's renounced all material desires, which means he's got no impetus for acting for sense gratification, nor engaging in fruitive activity. So Burijan adds in his commentary that such a yogi may continue to do his work, which consists mostly of prescribed duties, not out of attachment, but to set a proper example. So Krishna has also spoken about that, how kings like Janak continue to do their duties in order to set a good example for others. And the other thing that Burijan Prabhu was stressing is that the non-attraction to sense object is required for one in the yogārūḍhas state. Okay, so now I just want to try and cover some of the philosophy, hopefully in a little organized way. So these things, this section of Bhagavad Gita is from text 1 to text 4. So this verse today is the end of this section, which is describing advancing in yoga through detached work. So this advancing in yoga was described earlier as being prescribed duties, as being attached work. And here it's described as being nishkam karma yoga, which means acting according to prescription of the scriptures without attachment in order to get to a higher state. So the practical application of this state is that the renunciant manifests detachment from possessiveness and enjoying propensity, but that does not necessarily cease activity. So a devotee fulfills this because he is acting for the pleasure of Krishna. So therefore he gives up all possessiveness and enjoying propensity. He continues to act, but only for the pleasure of Krishna. So just a summary from the purport for today's verse. Krishna consciousness fulfills the criteria of yogārūḍhas state by engagement in transcendental loving service. Srila Prabhupada explains that one is always pleased within oneself and no longer engaged in sense gratification. And the Krishna conscious person can do everything for Krishna's satisfaction and thus perfectly detached from sense gratification. So this, I explained, is this coming to this perfect yogārūḍhas state is when we manage to think of Krishna all the time. Srila Prabhupada also stresses in this purport how that without Krishna consciousness, one must be engaged in sense gratification because the senses will always be engaged. So either we're engaged in Krishna's service or we're engaged for sense gratification. And anyone who is not engaged in Krishna consciousness is always self-centered and seeking extended selfish activity. And at the last line of the report, Srila Prabhupada stresses that if someone is not Krishna conscious, then they have to attempt to get to Ashtanga Yoga mechanically, which is very, very difficult. So as I said, this purpose of the yoga is about controlling the mind and senses, which will lead to controlling the senses in the beginning, which will lead to control of the mind. So in the verses 5 to 6, the central point of yoga is stress, which is controlling the mind, to draw the mind away from sense objects, and thus the mind becomes a friend. The Prabhupada talks in his class how one must sometimes beat the mind in order to keep it under control and not let it get dragged away by senses. Now, he gave a class, right, he gave an example in a class, this Los Angeles class that I was speaking of before. The mind is the driver. The body is the chariot or car. If you ask your driver to take you to the Krishna consciousness temple, the driver will take you there. If you ask your driver to take you to the liquor house, he will drive you there. The driver's business is to drive you wherever you like. Similarly, your mind is the driver. And if the driver takes your license, then he will take you wherever he likes, and you're finished. Then your driver is your enemy. But if your driver acts on your order, then he's your friend. So actually the yoga system means to control the mind in such a way that he will act as your friend and not as your enemy. So this is a very nice example. If we think of the mind as the driver, if the mind does what our intelligence is telling us to do, take us to the Krishna conscious temple, then the mind is our friend. But if it takes us in another direction, if we allow it to get away and take us in another direction, then it becomes our enemy. So that's described earlier in the Bhagavad Gita. Now I want to give some examples here. We have an example of the yogi who came to the perfect stage in Dhruva Maharaj. Srila Prabhupada gives this example in his class. So we know the story of Dhruva Maharaj. It's an example for so many things. It's very important. And earlier now, Braj Bandhu Parikrama, the Parikrama, I think on about the third or fourth day, went to Madhavan, which is the place where Dhruva Maharaj performed his austerity. And there's a place there called Dhruva Tilla, where he did this. So Dhruva Maharaj, he had a strong desire. So in the beginning of the stage, you can say he's the beginning of the yoga practice. He has strong desires to get a kingdom better than his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. Very strong desire. And he was advised first by his stepmother, who wouldn't let him sit on the king's lap. She said, if you want anything, you have to first worship the Supreme Lord. And his mother confirmed that and said, yes, she's right. If you want, the only one who can fulfill your desires is the Supreme Lord. And he said, well, where is he? And his mother said, well, I don't know, but I've heard that sages go to the forest to search him out. So Narad set off for the forest. On the way, he met Narad Muni, who tested him and became his spiritual master after passing the test by rejecting simple advice to go home and be peaceful. Narad Muni gave Dhruva Maharaj good instructions of how to engage in yoga system and worship of the Lord. Narad Muni says, any person who desires the fruits of the four principles of religiosity, economic development, sense gratification, and the end liberation, should engage himself in the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. For worship of his lotus feet yields the fulfillment of all these. My dear boy, I thus wish all good fortune to you. You should go to the bank of the Yamuna, where there is a virtuous forest named Madhuvan, and there be purified. Just by going there, one draws nearer to the Supreme Personality Godhead, who always lives there. My dear boy, in the waters of the Yamuna, which is known as Kalindi, you should take 3 baths daily, because the water is very auspicious, sacred, and clear. After bathing, you should perform the necessary regulative principles for Ashtanga Yoga, and then sit down on your asana, sitting place, in a calm and quiet position. So this is all this beginning stage of yoga as described in yesterday's verse, how we've got all these rules and regulations and prohibited things to do and things not to do before we come to this perfect state. After sitting on your seat, practice 3 kinds of breathing exercises. Thus gradually control your life, ear, mind, and senses. Completely free yourself from all material contamination, and with great patience begin to meditate on the Supreme Personality of God. So then Narad Muni gives a full description of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, what he looks like, so that Dhruva will know how to meditate on. And he gives them the mantra, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, because this is Satya Yuga, and this is the mantra for Satya Yuga. And gives them instructions how to worship the form of the Lord. Even in the forest, he says one should worship the Lord by offering pure water, pure flower garlands, fruits, flowers, and vegetables, which are available in the forest, or by collecting newly grown grass, small buds of flowers, or even the skins of trees, and if possible, offering tulsi leaves, which are very dear to the Supreme Personality of God. In the forest, one can make a form with no more than earth and water, and worship him according to the above principles. So full instructions for worshiping, meditating on the Supreme Lord, worshiping the Supreme Lord, regular principles of bathing, various other prescribed duties, asana and pranayama breathing exercises. So then it's described later how Narad Muni perfects in text 71. Dhruva Maharaj, having arrived at Madhavan, took his bath in the river Yamuna and observed fasting in the night with great care and attention. After that, as advised by the great sage Narad, he engaged himself in worshipping the Supreme Personality of God. So the Acharyas have stated that Dhruva Maharaj's success was because he perfectly followed the instructions of his spiritual master. And he was very determined. So at this stage, he's only at the beginning stage. He begins, but he very quickly advances. For the first month, Dhruva Maharaj ate only fruits and berries every 3rd day. In the 2nd month, he ate only every 6 days, and he took dry grass and leaves. In the 3rd month, he drank water every 9 days. Thus he remained completely in trance, worshipping the Supreme Personality of God. In the 4th month, Dhruva Maharaj became a complete master of breathing exercise, inhaled air only every 12th day. By the 5th month, Dhruva had controlled his breathing so perfectly that he was able to stand only on one leg, just as a column stands without motion, and concentrate his mind fully on Parabrahma. When Dhruva Maharaj thus captured the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the refuge of the total material creation, and who is the master of all living entities, the 3 worlds began to tremble. As Dhruva Maharaj, the king's son, kept himself steadily standing on one leg, the pressure of his big toe pushed down half the earth, just as an elephant being carried on a boat rocks the boat left and right with his every step. So the total universal breathing choked up, and all the demigods felt suffocating and took shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So at this point, Dhruva Maharaj has reached this yogārūḍhas stage. The Supreme Personality of Godhead says, dear demigods, don't be perturbed by this. This is just my devotee. I shall stop this boy from his severe austerities, and you shall be saved from this situation. So in this, Dhruva Maharaj has perfected himself to the yogārūḍhas state. And the Supreme Lord came in front of his meditation, stopped his meditation, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the Lord was personally present. So this is exactly describing this yogārūḍhas state. Now, interestingly enough, there is another story of someone who did a somewhat similar meditation, and that is Hiranyakashipu. Hiranyakashipu wanted to become unconquerable and free from old age and dwindling of body. He wanted to gain all the yogic perfections like Animara and Laguna, to be deathless, and to be the only king of the entire universe, including Brahmaloka. So Hiranyakashipu also has a very strong desire. In the valley of the Mandara hill, Hiranyakashipu began performing austerities by standing with his toes on the ground, keeping his arms upward looking towards the sky. This position was extremely difficult, but he accepted it as a means of perfection. So Hiranyakashipu was also very determined in his austerity. From the hair of Hiranyakashipu's head there emanated an effulgent light, as brilliant as and intolerable as the rays of the sun at the time of dissolution. Seeing the performance of such severe austerities, the demigods who have been wandering throughout the planet returned to their respective homes. Because of Hiranyakashipu's severe austerities, fire came from his head, and this fire and smoke spread throughout the sky, encompassing the upper, low, and lower planets, which all became extremely hot. Because of the power of his severe austerities, all the rivers and oceans were agitated. The surface of the globe, with its mountains and islands, began trembling, and all the stars and planets fell. Scorched and extremely disturbed because of Hiranyakashipu's severe penances, all the demigods left their planet where they reside and went to the planet of Lord Brahma, where they informed the Creator as follows: O Lord of the demigods, O Master of the universe, because of the fire emanated from Hiranyakashipu's head as a result of his severe austerity, we are becoming so disturbed that we cannot stay in our planet, and we've come to you. So Lord Brahma then goes to see Hiranyakashipu. O king, thus being informed by the demigods, the most powerful Lord Brahma, accompanied by Bhrigu, Daksha, and other great sages, immediately started for the place where Hiranyakashipu was performing penances and austerity. So Hiranyakashipu, he was perhaps not so quick at doing his austerity, because in the beginning Lord Brahma could not find where Hiranyakashipu was, because Hiranyakashipu's body was covered by an anthill and by grass and bamboo sticks. The ants had devoured his skin, fat, flesh, and blood. Lord Brahma and the demigods spotted him, resembling a cloud-covered sun, heating the whole world by his austerity. Struck with wonder, Lord Brahma began to smile and addressed him as follows. So Lord Brahma was pleased that he had done severe austerity, and not being as all-knowing as the Supreme Lord Krishna, he just promised to give him what he wanted before he even found out what he wanted. So Lord Brahma then restored his body with some water from his Pancha Mandali. So you can see there's quite some similarities in these two stories. Both are by the performance of severe austerity. But the difference is there at the end of the austerity. Lord Dhruva, he came to the perfect stage of yogārūḍhas. He came to the perfect stage of getting rid of all his material desires. So when he finally met the Supreme Lord, he mentioned that, oh my Lord, I don't want anything anymore. Having seen you, I don't need anything. Let me just go where Srila Prabhupada has explained this story. Okay. So when he saw God, Narayan, he was no more anxious for the kingdom of his father. No more anxious. He said, "My dear Lord, I am satisfied, fully satisfied. I do not want any more. My kingdom, the kingdom of my father." He gave the comparison that I was searching out some pebbles, but I got valuable jewels. So this means he was more satisfied, which is what's described in today's verse. So Srila Prabhupada adds, when you actually connect yourself with God, then you feel yourselves many million times more satisfied than enjoying it in this material world. That is God realization. That is the perfection of yoga. So when a person, this is from the purport, when a person fully engages in transcendental loving service of the Lord, he is pleased within himself, and thus he no longer engages in sense gratification or fruitive activity. So this is the point. And Prabhupada also says at the end of the purport, otherwise one must be engaged in sense gratification, since one cannot live without engagement. So we can see then, in the case of Hiranyakashipu, who also performed such great austerity, equally great austerity, and perhaps for a longer time, by the time the ants got all over him and ate him alive. But he did not come to that point of peace. He did not come to the point of perfection of yogārūḍhas, even though he'd done such severe austerity that he attracted the attention of Lord Brahma, who also affected the whole universe. Dhruva Maharaj affected the whole universe because the breathing in the universe was choked up because he was austere with his breathing. And Hiranyakashipu affected the whole universe because the force of his austerities created such heat and fire from his head that he was burning the whole universe alive. So the severeness of austerities was similar, but the result was different because Dhruva Maharaj came to the point of Krishna consciousness, which of course was because he was worshipping the Supreme Lord, because he was given advice, good advice, from his stepmother, from his mother, and then from his formal guru, which is Narad Muni. So he took advice and followed it. Whereas Hiranyakashipu, he started his own austerity in order to attract Lord Brahma's attention. But it doesn't say that he took anyone's advice before he started. So he had strong material desires, and he was never purified of those material desires, even though he managed to control his physical sense. He never controlled his mind and his desires for sense gratification. So in the end, Lord Krishna, of course, had to rectify that. Okay, so now that will conclude our class for today. If anyone wants to add any comments or questions, you may unmute and do so. All right, so, Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Thank you for a nice class. Lavangalata Mataji.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We'll finish the class here. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.